The week after Constance Heller's landscaping crew reduced my 7-year arborvitae hedge to 8-inch stumps, I did 4 things in this order. I documented the damage with the same thoroughness I applied to every engineering project I had managed in 23 years of practice. I called my attorney. I called the structural materials supplier I had been working with since my 2nd year in the business to place an order for 800 concrete blocks, 12 cubic yards of structural grout, 400 pounds of rebar, and enough Type S mortar to build something that would still be standing when everyone involved in this situation had moved away or died. And I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a legal pad and began designing the wall that I had been thinking about since the first HOA complaint 7 months earlier, when I had understood, with the specific clarity that comes from 23 years of pattern recognition in structural systems, that the behavioral solutions were not going to work, and that I was eventually going to be doing exactly what I was now doing. My name is Delia Forsyth. I am 51 years old, a licensed structural engineer specializing in masonry systems and foundation design with 23 years of experience in residential and commercial construction, and I have lived in the Maplewood Terrace HOA development in central Georgia for 8 years. My husband, Patrick, is a civil litigation attorney. When I tell you that having a civil litigation attorney as a husband was useful in this situation, I want to be clear that I mean this in the specific sense that Patrick understood from the first HOA complaint what trajectory we were on and had been preparing the legal documentation in parallel with everything else from month 1. Not because he assumed the worst, but because he had spent 28 years watching situations and he knew what a situation looked like when it was heading somewhere specific. The arborvitae hedge had been my project. I had planted it in my 2nd year in Maplewood Terrace along the northern boundary of our rear yard. Started from 5-gallon stock, I had selected from a grower I had researched for 6 weeks because I approach material selection the same way regardless of whether the material is concrete or living plant. 7 years of growth had produced a dense evergreen screen 14 feet tall along 96 linear feet of boundary that gave our rear yard the visual enclosure that made it function as an outdoor room, which was how Patrick and I used it, as an extension of the house where we spent summer evenings and where I had a covered workspace for my architectural models, and where Patrick had a reading area that he had used every evening the weather permitted for 6 years. Constance Heller was the HOA board president. She was 62, recently retired from a career as a hospital administrator, and she had been board president for 11 months. She had filed 3 complaints about my hedge during those 11 months. The complaints cited varying provisions of the Maplewood Terrace CC and RS, none of which actually addressed hedge height in the specific terms she claimed. The board had dismissed the first 2 complaints. The 3rd complaint had produced a tied vote 3-3, which under the CC and RS meant the violation finding failed, and the complaint was dismissed. After the 3rd dismissal, Constance had sent a landscaping crew to my property on a Tuesday morning while Patrick was in court, and I was on a site inspection 2 hours away. I am not going to describe what I felt when the camera alert reached my phone at 10:12 in the morning, because feelings are not the relevant unit of measurement here. What I am going to describe is what I did, which was to call Patrick at the courthouse, reach his assistant, have Patrick step out of a deposition, describe what was happening in 2 sentences, hear Patrick say, "I will have an emergency motion filed by noon," end the call, take 47 photographs of the destruction in progress from the camera feeds on my phone, forward them to Patrick's office email, and return to the site inspection I was conducting because the structural assessment I was completing had a deadline and the camera was recording and Patrick was handling the legal response, and there was nothing I could accomplish by driving 2 hours to stand in my yard watching a crew work. The motion Patrick filed was an emergency injunction request citing ongoing property destruction during a pending HOA enforcement dispute. The board had not had a vote supporting the enforcement action. Constance had authorized the crew unilaterally. The motion included the timestamp footage from my cameras showing the crew entering my property and working, the prior 3 complaint records and their dismissals, and Patrick's analysis of why Constance's unilateral action was unauthorized under the CC and RS and potentially tortious under Georgia property law. The crew finished the work before the injunction was served. The hearing happened the following morning. Judge Rachel Osai in the Central Georgia Superior Court reviewed Patrick's filing and the board's response, which was filed by an attorney who had been retained on an emergency basis by the HOA's insurance carrier and who appeared with the specific expression of a lawyer who had read the file overnight and understood the situation her client was in. Judge Osai said the board voted 3-3 on the underlying complaint, which under the CC and RS constitutes a failure of the enforcement motion. The board president subsequently authorized enforcement without a valid board vote. Is that accurate? The HOA's attorney said, "Your Honor, the board president believed she had inherent authority as president to enforce community standards." Judge Osai said, the CC and RS require a board majority vote for enforcement actions. That requirement exists specifically to prevent unilateral enforcement by individual board members. The president's belief about inherent authority is not consistent with the document that governs her authority. She issued a finding of improper enforcement and noted that the destruction of property during a pending dispute without valid board authorization was a matter the court would consider in the damages assessment. The damages assessment was Patrick's domain, and he was thorough in the way that civil litigators who are also detail-oriented people are thorough, which is to say he built the case the way I build structural systems, from the foundation up, with every element specified and documented and connected to every other element with the correct material and the correct joint. The hedge valuation I prepared covered replacement cost, installation labor, growth time value using the horticultural valuation methodology I had used professionally and that had appeared in prior accounts in this collection, and a function value element that quantified the economic impact of losing a 7-year established outdoor privacy screen on the use and enjoyment of our rear yard. Patrick reviewed the assessment and said it was as tight as any expert report he had seen in 28 years of civil litigation. The total valuation was $36,000. Patrick's civil claim added his fees, compensatory damages for the 3-complaint harassment pattern, and punitive damages supported by the finding of unauthorized enforcement. The total claim was $61,000. Constance retained Philip Cross. Patrick knew Philip from prior cases and told me that Philip was a competent attorney who would give his client an honest assessment of the exposure and recommend settlement. Philip called Patrick within a week. The negotiation took 11 days. Philip's opening position was $30,000. Patrick's response was that $61,000 was the demand and the punitive damages exposure made it defensible. Philip came back with $45,000. Patrick came back with $58,000. Philip came back with $52,000. Patrick said $55,000 was the floor and called it a final position. Constance paid $55,000. Her homeowner's insurance covered $28,000. She paid $27,000 personally. The HOA's board voted to censure her the week after the settlement, and she resigned from the board the week after the censure. Now I need to describe the wall, because the wall is where this story diverges from the prior accounts in this collection in a way that reflects who I am professionally and what I was thinking about during the 7 months between the first complaint and the destruction. I am a masonry systems engineer. I have spent 23 years working with concrete, block, brick, and stone as structural materials. When I say I was thinking about the wall from the first complaint, I mean I was thinking about it as an engineering problem with specific parameters, not as a revenge fantasy or an aesthetic statement. The parameters were these. The wall needed to be structurally definitive, meaning it needed to be the kind of construction that people who understood masonry would recognize as serious work built to commercial specification rather than residential minimum. It needed to serve a legitimate and demonstrable function. It needed to be beautiful in the specific way that correctly executed masonry is beautiful, which is the beauty of precision and proportion and material honesty. And it needed to be permanent in a way that communicated something about the situation that produced it. That last parameter was the one I had spent the most time with. What did I want a person looking at this wall to understand? I wanted them to understand that it had been designed and built by someone who knew exactly what they were doing, that it would outlast every structure in Maplewood Terrace, and that its existence was the direct consequence of a decision someone else had made. The wall I designed was 10 feet of 12-inch concrete masonry units with number 5 rebar at 16 inches on center, both horizontally and vertically, structural grout fill in all cores, and a poured concrete bond beam at the top course tying everything together. The footing was a continuous spread footing at 42 inches depth, 6 inches below the Georgia frost depth, and considerably below what a residential privacy fence would require, because I was building a wall, and when I build walls, I build them to last. The exterior face, the one visible from Constance's property to the north, was a split-face block that I had used on a commercial project 2 years earlier, and that I knew produced a surface with the specific textured quality of exposed aggregate, a surface that registered as substantial and intentional and serious to anyone who looked at it. The interior face, visible from our garden, was smooth-faced block with a sand finish that I had chosen because it was warm and correct against the Georgia light, and because smooth-faced block with a sand finish on a properly built masonry wall is one of the most beautiful things I know how to produce with my hands and my training. I built it myself. Not entirely, Patrick helped with the rebar placement and the grout mixing and the block delivery, and I hired a masonry laborer named Burl Caston for the heavy lifting because 96 linear feet of 12-inch block at 10 feet is a significant material volume, and Burl was strong and reliable and had worked with me before. But the layout, the corner assembly, the bond beam, the footing form, all of it was mine. I wanted it to be mine because this wall was going to stand for 40 years, and I wanted to know that I had built it correctly. Construction took 8 days. The first 2 days were footing work. Days 3 through 7 were block work, 2 feet of height per day to allow each course to develop adequate strength before loading the next. Day 8 was the bond beam pour and the cap installation. When it was done, I walked the full length of the interior face in the afternoon light and looked at the proportions and the coursework and the joint finishing, and I said nothing to anyone for approximately 5 minutes because I was assessing it the way I assess all my work, and what I found was that it was correct. Patrick came out and stood next to me. He said, "It is impressive." I said, "It is correct." He said, "What is the difference?" I said, "Impressive is an aesthetic judgment. Correct is a technical assessment. This wall is correct. Whether it is impressive depends on who is looking." He said, "I find it impressive." I said, "You are not a structural engineer." He said, "No, but I have been watching you build things for 26 years, and I can tell when something is serious work." I said, "It is serious work." He said, "Constance can see the split face from her property." I said, "Yes." He said, "What do you think she sees?" I said, "I think she sees a wall that will be here when she is gone." He said, "Is that what you intended her to see?" I said, "I intended to build a correct wall on the boundary of my property. What she sees when she looks at it is her own concern." He said, "The footing is at 42 inches. I said, "Yes." He said, "The Georgia frost depth is 36. I said, "I know." He said, "You over-engineered it." I said, "I built it to the specification I hold for all my masonry work. Whether that constitutes over-engineering depends on what standard you apply." He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "You wanted it to last." I said, "I want everything I build to last. That is the standard." He went inside. I walked the wall one more time in the last of the afternoon light, running my hand along the smooth interior face, checking the joint tooling, confirming the vertical plumb at 3 points. Everything was within specification. The wall was correct. Howard Park, the retired architect who appeared in prior accounts and who apparently lived everywhere simultaneously, or whose specific quality of attentive observation I was inventing as a consistent character in this collection. Because what I actually mean is that there is always someone in a neighborhood who notices the quality of construction and comments on it accurately, came by 2 weeks after the wall was complete. He looked at the split-face exterior and then came through the gate to look at the smooth interior face. He said the core specification is commercial. I said rebar at 16 on center, full grout fill, poured bond beam. He said for a residential privacy wall. I said for a wall I am building once. He said the footing depth. I said 42 inches. He said you are a masonry engineer. I said among other things. He looked at the smooth interior face. He said the joint tooling. I said concave 3/8 inch, standard for smooth face CMU. He said you did the joint tooling yourself. I said I do my own joint tooling on my own projects. He said I have been an architect for 32 years. I have seen a lot of masonry work. This is as good as any commercial job I have reviewed. I said it is built to commercial specification. The quality follows from the specification. He looked at the wall for a long time. He said, Constance Heller resigned from the board. I said, yes. He said she is listing her house. I said, I heard. He said she will have to disclose the wall to buyers. I said the wall is a permitted improvement to my property. It is on my side of the property line. There is nothing to disclose that would disadvantage a buyer of her property. He said she will have to look at it until she moves. I said the split-face texture is a standard commercial block finish. It is not unpleasant to look at. He said, that is very generous of you to say. I said I am not being generous. I selected that finish because I thought it was correct for the application and because I have used it on commercial projects and I know how it ages. It will look better in 10 years than it does today as the surface weathers slightly and the texture deepens. He said, you chose a finish that improves with age. I said, I choose materials that improve with age when I can. Masonry generally does. It is one of the things I appreciate about the material. He went home. I stood in the rear yard for a moment in the Georgia autumn, the wall to the north smooth-faced and warm-toned in the afternoon light. The outdoor room we had been using for 6 years restored to its enclosed character by the wall that had replaced the hedge. The covered work area, where I kept my architectural models accessible again from the afternoon shade the wall provided. The function had been restored. The boundary was established. The documentation was filed and the settlement was paid, and Constance Heller was listing her house. The wall would be standing when the next owners moved in, and when the owners after them moved in, and when everyone who currently had an opinion about it was finished having opinions. I went inside. Patrick was at his desk reviewing a filing. He looked up. He said, good. I said, everything is correct. He said, the wall. I said, the wall is correct. The documentation is filed. The settlement is paid. The board has a new president who called this morning to introduce herself and said she had read the full file and found the prior board's conduct indefensible. He said, what is she like? I said she asked good questions. She understood the CC and RS before she asked them. She told me she had been an HOA board member in her prior neighborhood for 6 years and that she had a strong opinion about board presidents acting without board authorization. He said she will be fine. I said yes, she will be fine. He went back to his filing. I made tea and sat at the kitchen table looking out toward the rear garden where the wall was visible through the window in the way that a 10-foot masonry structure is visible through a window, which is to say it was simply there, solid and permanent and correctly built, in exactly the position where a hedge had stood for 7 years before someone made a decision that produced it. The hedge had been good. The hedge had been 7 years of careful selection and patient growth, and the specific satisfaction of a material that rewards attention. The wall was different, but it was also good in the way that masonry systems are good when they are built correctly, with the durability and the honesty of material and the specific quality that comes from specification applied consistently. Both were real, both were mine. One had been taken and one had replaced it, and what replaced it was more permanent than what had been taken, and that was the shape of the consequence. It was enough. It was always going to be enough when the work was correct, and the documentation was thorough, and the legal process was followed completely, and the wall was built to specification. The standard was the thing that made it enough. The standard was always the thing. Thumbnail text: she destroyed his wall engineer wife's 7-year hedge. The engineer built a wall to commercial specification that will outlast everyone involved.